Hello, Kate Silverton. Welcome to the Therapy Works podcast. And as we were sort of waiting for the kind of beginning of the podcast, I thought there is a kind of paradox of us wanting to have a really deeply personal and intimate conversation, and yet we're being filmed, we're going to be listened to, and you're one of the few therapists I've interviewed on the podcast. So there's a kind of navigation between the public and the personal that I think is very interesting, and something that I think you navigate a lot in your world and in your multiple roles.
It's a really good point, isn't it? Thank you for raising that, because actually I feel quite fizzy having thought about that myself in what we bring into the room, because your conversations clearly are intimate. And as a therapist, and having done a lot of my own work in therapy, of course, I've learned how to be very contained. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
I mean, so you have a lot, unlike me in a way, you have a lot of experience as a broadcaster, as a news presenter, terrifyingly being a contestant on Strictly Come Dancing, which must be the most frightening kind of live programme, just about the only live programme on telly now, I think.
Yes.
And now you're a child therapist. And I guess when I was thinking about you and reading your wonderful 2 books, which we will talk about, I was trying to work out what are the roots in you that led you through the kind of different doorways, because I think one leads to the other in some way. But when in your own therapy, when you look back, have you made sense of who you are now and how you got to be here?
Yes, very much so. It's taken quite a while to get there. Yeah, but absolutely, I think where to begin? Probably you would say at the beginning, but it's understanding, having experienced very complex trauma as a child, which shaped my entire life landscape and required a lot of healing and a lot of work. But having come out the other side, one looks back and of course you can see things playing out very clearly. And there was a lot of running, always running.
Flight,
Yeah.
in the kind of emotional
in
sense,
that
fight or flight,
yes.
You're in a heightened...
Yeah, and trying to find oneself and also running from what was. And so, you know, the experiences I've had have given me great gifts, although I have to say I'm very hypervigilant. So the hypervigilance when I'm talking about
in your body.
is in my body. But I'm at peace with that. It serves me very well as a therapist working with children, because I'm very aware of, I suppose, of my own inner being.
I don't want to kind of push too far, but the question I ask all of my clients is, what is the greatest challenge you are facing or have faced? And I imagine it is this complex, traumatic number of experiences or experience that you experience as a child. I don't know if you can say more about that, or, I mean, you don't need to, because it's intensely personal.
Yeah, I'll sit with it. I'm as I say, I've learned to be very contained. I'll sit with that. But it's what drives us, as we all know, sort of what we experience in our very early years shapes the adult we become. But there's so many facets of working in the public eye that see me, hear me. If we're not heard as children, it can be a natural,
needing attention.
Yes, and the affirmation that I'm alive, that I'm here,
that I exist,
that
I'm allowed to exist.
Yes. So, and workaholism, constant driving forward, never stopping, never to rest, never celebrating where you are, because you've just got to keep going.
Keep running.
And
that comes from a kind of fear that you don't even... Are you saying that you didn't at the time fully recognise that it was fear that was your engine?
No. And I don't think we do when we're in the grip of it. And of course, it's only in therapy. Still thank my first therapist, whom I dedicated the second book to, Lisa, for finding my husband, because that's something I give, therapy has given me the gift of him, my healthy relationship, and my children.
Gosh.
And I can safely say I would be without both, I think, if it hadn't, or all my 2 children and my husband, if I hadn't had therapy. And the learning that comes then, so going into the news again, working live, you know, you're exercising your stress response, you're feeling alive.
You're in war zones.
Yes.
You're significant, you're heard.
Yeah. And telling the story, you know, of others, helping to shine a spotlight on suffering, which of course I will understand now, we will understand, is helping me with my little girl suffering. So all of that made absolute sense. You know, once I obviously was able to peel those onion layers away that we often talk about in therapy, there's so many, aren't there? And to really get to the heart of what was driving my behaviours. And then really having my own children and starting to explore behaviour, and I love learning. So all the neuroscience and the neurobiology, all the developments that we know now in terms of vagus nerve and all the things that we now know that actually trauma sits in the body, really drove. So the journalist hat, and then this sort of love of learning, but also my own learning and the discoveries that I'd had in my own personal therapy. I wanted to sort of break that cycle for my children and to be the best parent. Of course, we all want that. So I started to interview. So as you'll know, the Anna Freud Centre very well, and I got to know Professor Peter Fonagy, Eamon McCrory, your husband, talking to lots of neuroscientists and psychotherapists and psychiatrists, and just explain to me why my children are doing what they're doing, because I think I know from my own stuff, but actually I want to understand the nuts and bolts, the science behind it. And that's when the light bulb really went on in terms of the importance of sharing the wisdom of what these incredible researchers and experts have done for decades. And that became, and actually it was when Peter Fonagy sat and wagged his finger at me. I was volunteering at the time with some of the families at the centre and really finding that that was my place. I really felt at home. And I was still working in news at that time. And Peter said to me, you know, we can work with the children who've suffered the acute trauma and complex trauma, but actually lots of parents need help and support. That's your job. You've got to go away and write a book that we can all understand, because we talk in long sentences with big words. And so he challenged me really to write the first book. And then I thought, well, I'm in this space. I'm at home here. I understand you're not going out into the world to become a wounded healer. You need to do your own work and finish. I mean, as we all know, we're still learning, but you've got to get over your own, go into your own black hole and come out the other side before I'm going to release you into the world. And
can I, because I'm trying to kind of navigate all that you said, and there's so much that is a really kind of fascinating path. And in a way, what I understand is that as a child, the thing that has led you to be a therapist now is that you're giving to your own children and to children in the future through your books an understanding and an insight and a knowledge that you didn't have yourself.
yes.
And that, in a way, connects me to the wounded healer. So although Lisa says to you, don't be the wounded healer, I think there's always an aspect of ourselves that's reparative
Yes.
of ourselves, like doing what we didn't get. But also, it feels like the curiosity in you is your driver, because I think you're saying, and I wonder about this kind of emotionally, if I can make sense of something, or if I have the science that can back it up, then I can allow it. And often trauma and emotional feelings we never can make sense of. And however much work we do, there's no sense to be made of really traumatic events, that we just have to find a way of living with it. And that feels like quite a contradiction in some ways.
I think I would say, so first of all, on the wounded healer, you're absolutely right. So it's not, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, if I wasn't clear. I think she didn't want me to go out incomplete. So there's a sense of, oh, I know, I mean, none of us know everything, of course, but I think she really wanted me to do a much deeper dive before I went out and started talking about my own
So
journey.
you'd have more confidence and be more grounded.
And yes, I think to be more grounded. And also because it took me at least another 5 years before I could really sit there and go into that experience and give words to it. When my dad taught me to drive, my dad was a London cabbie. And
He sounds wonderful, your dad.
he's yeah. And before he could teach me to drive, my elder sister, she cracked on with it. But I literally couldn't start the engine until I knew what was going on underneath the bonnet. He had to talk me through everything. What are the spark plugs? How do the gears work? And he was like that. So I think that's where I get that. Once I understand something, I get it.
The
mechanics of it. And then obviously in the journalism, I find it easy to then explain it. So there's that what we call psychoeducation. And to be able to take away the mystery and the fear around mental health, that fuels me. And there is obviously the driver in me that doesn't want anyone to be held hostage by what they fear inside. So I want them to be able to understand in the way that I've been able to understand myself. Yes, I've had some pretty dark places to go to in order to sit here now and talk in the way that we're talking, but that we can come out the other side with help. And therapy, as you will imagine, I'm a huge advocate of. But relationships, any relationships are healing. If they're good, healthy relationships.
So the relationships, if Lisa, you said she gave you the gift of your husband and that gave you the gift of your children. For people listening who haven't stepped into therapy, who haven't had a therapist yet, or people who are just starting, do you know what it was about the therapy that enabled you to have a healthy relationship, that freed you in a way?
So I'm quite a fighter and...
combative, like...
No, I guess a survivor, a little warrior, and I don't like to be felled by fear. Again, that comes from that little girl who survived. And so whenever I think that there's some learning to do, I do get stuck in. And so I met Mike, fell in love pretty quickly. And
he's an SAS. He's
a former Royal Marines.
Royal Marines.
And I met him just before I was going to Iraq. I had to have what we call hostile environments training. And saw him standing there with his arms folded as I walked through the door. I was all enthusiastic and probably quite useless. And there he was standing there. Cool.
Steady.
Yeah, steady and handsome. And I thought, oof. And that was the start. But then, you see, I was a complete commitment phobe, not trusting.
No good reason to trust from your experience.
No. So there was this, so I really tried my hardest to push him away, really. I tested him. We broke up a number of times and I went off and dated other men. And I'd come into Lisa and I'd come in floods of tears, say, why did I do that? This person is not great, shielding people, but actually this person's not great. And she'd clap her hands almost with glee and say, till you learn the lesson, this is all the material. Until you learn the lesson, you're going to keep being sent these men. Underneath, she, of course, knew that Mike was the one. She actually, the day that I phoned her and said, it's him, isn't it? It's him. It's him, he's the one. She was like, hallelujah. She didn't say that to me.
She finally got it.
Yeah, she said she could still remember being in this wood yard where she was out and yeah, thank goodness, So
you kept falling in the hole until you finally walked around the hole.
Yeah.
So you kept doing the same thing of avoiding good, reliable, loving relationships.
Yeah.
And acting out your experience.
Yes. Yeah.
And something clicked. Do you know what clicked?
I think I'd got to the point where I remember, Lisa, there was a point at which I'd lived my life in that sort of what some might ascribe to as bipolar. I don't particularly like labels, but that the highs and the lows. And Lisa said that, or had me reflect, that I thought that living was up here, and I'm raising my hand because we're on radio, but I'm up here, or then you have the terrible slump of the depression that comes on the other side. And I thought that was life.
So two extremes. That was your norm, as it were.
Yeah.
In a very heightened,
yes,
almost ecstatic, but also vigilant state to a kind of frozen...
shutdown.
Shutdown.
Yeah. And she drew a line in the air, just a flat line. And she said, "This is where beauty lies." And I said, "That looks like a flat line. Looks like dead to me." And she, she said, "That's where the beauty is." And so to get me to then condense all this beautiful energy, I thank myself for my energy and my survival mechanisms, but to go into that beautiful flat line and to live life in a much more balanced, considered, grounded way, appreciating everything that my husband brought and brings still, that was the beauty. But I could only get there by going and recognizing what that was about, what the ups and downs were about.
And in a way, what the neuroscience teaches us, that when you're in a very heightened state or in a frozen kind of cut-off state, our capacity to be emotionally open is also offline. So that you can feel very excited, but your capacity to feel your heart, connect to others, be how we are now, like be really open to fully engage in your emotional being in relation to others, comes from homeostasis, that regulatory state. And that's what Lisa meant by the beauty, wasn't it? So when you're there, although we seek highs, actually, and the kind of modern life constantly seduces us to go for the kick, doesn't it? Go for the high, the dopamine click on social media or alcohol or drugs. And actually what you've learned and are learning is being safe and being in some way at peace is where the beauty lives.
Absolutely. And that's why there's that passion to share with parents and for helping children, because children live in that really hyper state because they don't
in and out of the puddles.
They're not able to regulate in the way that we can, but learning those lessons very young to start, yes, we can feel joy up here and we can feel disappointment right down here, and they're really big feelings, and bring us back to that beautiful. So we're giving them the gift, I hope, then, that they will be able to take into adulthood that so many of us were never taught and weren't able to recognise unless we had the gift of being in therapy.
And in your book, No Such Thing as Naughty, you translate this regulation from hyperarousal to frozen as do you want to describe the animals, the wise owls?
Well, it's very, for all the neuroscientists out there, it's obviously clearly a very simplistic version.
But for people listening, I think it'd be really helpful to understanding themselves and their children.
Yeah, I think visually, and I know, when we're time poor parents, it can really help to have. So when I looked at the brain, and I follow the work very closely of Bruce Perry, who's an eminent child psychiatrist in the States, and I spoke to him before writing the book. So really the way that helps me to really visualize our brains is that our brainstem, the cerebellum, diencephalon, all the really ancient parts of our brain, the primitive parts of our brain that really are involved in the fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn, flop response, that I liken that to a little lizard. Because actually it's very primitive, and we can all imagine a lizard scurrying around, children that run around in circles when they're really, really scared. That's being driven by the part of the brain that's in fight, flight, literally the child is running, or they might...
but they're not connected to their prefrontal cortex, to their thinking not. Or their feelings.
No, and that part of the brain is the most primitive, the really ancient part of our brain involved in survival. So when it gets triggered, it takes over. It's in the driving seat. So when we try to impose our adult sort of, why are you behaving that way? We're asking something impossible of a child because they're being driven at that moment by a part of their brain that does not stop to think. So that little lizard
hear you.
Cannot hear,
no
cannot
receive
learn.
Button.
No. So that, for me, I wanted to find a way of saying to parents, look, think about how a lizard reacts. It might freeze, if there's something unsafe, a predator, a snake, or something in the long grass, that we might visualize the same way that a child who's frightened might go into freeze or just drop to the floor. They're overwhelmed. So that's that part of the brain that's driving that. And all these parts of the brain are obviously interconnected and act together, but that helps me. So that's the lizard. Then the baboon is the limbic system, our emotional, where our amygdala is and where our hippocampus. And that part of the brain is, and you can imagine a toddler beating their chest. They're in full-on baboon. They're feeling the highs and lows of life. But and the baboon and the lizard work very closely together. And I imagine them living in this tree with the lizard very down below, exposed at the bottom of the trunk. The baboon's on the first branch up above. So
beating its chest.
Yes, beating his chest, telling everybody, be careful. Yeah, there's danger. And he might go into fight. So I imagine that baboon jumping down and helping the lizard to sort of fend off any prey. And up above in the beautiful baobab tree that I visualise is our wise owl. And she is our prefrontal cortex, the regulatory part of our brain. And she's the part that helps us to have this conversation where we're going up and down and sort of able to have lots of different attuning and lots of different thoughts while we're speaking and regulating. And I imagine
and recalling the hippocampus, recalling memories so that you can use your previous experience to inform the present, isn't it?
Yes, I imagine her swooping down. So when there might be something that's jarring or that causes us to go into fight, flight, she recognises that there's an issue and she swoops down and she scoops up the baboon and the lizard with the warmth of her wings and she says, it's okay. It's all right. Actually, what you thought was a snake is actually a long stick, because she's got that beautiful big picture view because she's at the top of the tree. And that's what Dan Siegel calls vertical integration. Yeah. Beautiful. So this is what we want in life. It's not that our children or us are ever not going to be frightened or go into shock. But what we want is to then be able to engage our prefrontal cortex, what I imagine as a wise owl, and then soothe ourselves. And what can happen if we're not taught this, as I know all too well, is that if we don't have that vertical integration, we'll use other means to soothe ourselves, which can be work, cigarette, alcohol, food, all these things sex, that bring drugs, us sex, online, scrolling. It brings us that momentary soothing to bring us sort of back to balance, or we hope that it will, but it's obviously short-lived because they're, we don't really want
short-lasting drugs.
Yes. So when we can learn to soothe ourselves, we're giving ourselves the greatest gift. And so that, as I learned from Lisa, what she taught me is really what I want for parents to sort of really be helping to support their children with, and for teachers in the classroom as well. Because when we can recognise the behaviour, if I've got a child who's running around now and they're grabbing things and they're behaving quite erratically, my first thought is going to be, what's going on for them right now? And how can I help that child to feel a little bit safer? And obviously I see that big dysregulated behaviour in the therapy room. And what a joy and magic it is when I can help those children to calm back down. Yeah.
And I mean, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking, wouldn't the world be a different place politically where, we're in the middle of an election? There's a terrifying election happening in the US. And if that kind of very basic knowledge of self-soothing, of regulating, of thinking from a calm place rather than a shutdown or a heightened flight place. Our politics would be different. Our prisons wouldn't be so full. I mean, it seems that in a way it's at the heart of so much that is violent and disrupting and what can feel fragmenting and broken in society. And of course, you're starting where it has most influence, which is with children. And I think what I get from what you're saying is that even though you're starting with children, like for people who are listening who are both parents but also have a child inside them, it's never too late to heal your internal child.
Yeah, I love all the, again, Dan Siegel talks about the 89-year-old who was in therapy, and he told me about his story, and I love that. It's absolutely never too late. And I work now with parents and children, and I find that a really magical process, because I think coming at it from that place of compassion and understanding is much more helpful than trying to, as we know, sort of blame parents. Nobody wants to be put in that. We're all just
and
doing
all
our
parents
best.
are doing their best.
All parents
given
are
who
doing
they
their
are,
best.
where they've come from, their own history, the situation they're in.
I say to parents, were you taught how to regulate your emotions? Who was? So you can't blame yourself if you weren't taught. But once we know, we can't unknow, as I put it. And that's where we get the light bulbs going on, and I get the parents. Oh my goodness, the feedback at the moment is just extraordinary. And I actually last night received a call from a BBC team who said, how does it feel to know that your book has shaped and changed a school's behaviour policy? And
amazing.
Yeah, so that's going out tonight, their report. And the head teacher had read the book and she ripped up the behaviour policy and said, let's banish the shame-based policies. And
Not
we're
yelling
going
at
to
kids
bring
for
in,
being naughty.
well, and mums just messaged me just now on Instagram just saying, but my 5-year-old has been absolutely distraught all weekend because he was told off for something on Friday and has been told that he's going to get some form of detention on Monday.
It's like 5.
Come on.
Yeah.
I mean, where's the humanity? He's a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
So I think this is where, for me, the science is so important, because it's not just me sitting here, with some fanciful theory. This is science, this is fact, and actually, especially in educational establishments, why are we not doing the work ourselves and saying, let's bring the science to our policies? We need to have evidence-based policies. That goes for government level as well. So I am passionate that we
and
see
furious.
change.
I kind of there's a fury that from being furious of being injured is now being used as a force for good. I mean, I can feel that in your body, which I may not have felt if I wasn't in the room with you. There's a kind of fury.
Yes, it is. I'm always quick to say, I work in schools, so I get how difficult and challenging it is. Looking at the ratio, teachers are expected to do so much now, and there is a lot more dysregulated behaviour. And I work one-to-one with children, and yes, many of whom have experienced complex trauma, but equally we've got teachers in a classroom with maybe 30 children, and many of those may have
30%
experience.
at least. Yeah.
So we are expecting a huge amount. So teachers need support as well. I think I often hear from teachers who say they've left the profession, though, because they just said the humanity had gone. And that pains me. And I feel that we really do need to interrogate the policies that we're in and instilling and bringing into schools to think, hang on a moment, does this sit well with me, really? There's a pain that children are being, a 5-year-old, really? Or 4-year-olds being given stickers if they can walk through the gate without their parents. So the 4-year-old who may need their parents still to walk them through the gate doesn't get a sticker.
Blimey.
Yeah. But you see, I'm thinking of my husband at this point, because he grew up in, I say it in the first book, but his background is very deprived in terms of sort of emotional neglect and also financial. And he was given the free school meal ticket that was yellow when everybody else has a white one. And you go, did we not think how stigmatizing? So it's really, people act in their best intentions. I do have a fury. I guess I'm trying to find a way of saying I do have a fury on behalf of the children, but I also have an understanding that we are all trying to do our best. I just want to sort of turn the light bulb on so that people can start being a little bit more courageous and curious, as this head teacher has just done at St. Augustine's, to say, hang on a moment, am I serving children and their future mental health here? Can we do things differently? Let me learn. And it does take courage, actually, for all of us to look at where we might have been doing things differently. And I always say to parents, it's really courageous to be able to reflect and say, do you know what, I've been getting that wrong, and say sorry to their children. So powerful for bonding.
Really powerful. And when children, they learn from what's modelled. So when they hear you saying sorry, then they can learn that they can say sorry. But as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about the child in you, or aware of the child in you. And obviously I work with adults, I work with families too, kind of thinking, is the child looking at you now going, wow, you've changed. I mean, how is she talking to you now in a way that I imagine is very different?
Oh, she's giddy. So
And fizzy.
So for anyone listening, I also love internal family, so the IFS.
Dick Schwartz.
Yes. So where we understand ourselves by considering ourselves as parts, and which can sound slightly odd until I think it's explained. If we got
But everybody talks about themselves as parts. Like there's a part of me that feels this and there's a part of me that feels that.
Yes. And I think I've only come to really understand that in the last 5 years, and as we all must do, is to make peace with our little ones inside. But then, as we recognized in therapy, there's a 5, 6, there's a 3-year-old, there's a 5-year-old, there's a 7, and then we go into the teens. And really, as I see it, for me, I'll only speak for me, but in therapy what I did is go back and not only befriend but
Allow that part to speak.
Recognize the role they've been playing in doing what they thought was right for me at the time. What we can think of as our defenses, I now see as all my children, all the parts of me that were growing up and operating in a way that was really what they felt was keeping me safe. And in therapy, what I had to learn to do was to go back and say, thank you for doing that, even at times if it didn't make sense and sort of driven me to great distraction and despair. Often, actually, I get that you were doing your job in the only way you knew how.
So for listeners who don't know about internal family systems, often parts through injury or what's happened to us develop as protectors, and they become firefighters where they can kind of shout and scream and stamp, or they can become managers, and they can become addicts, many different ways of behaving. And working with clients, you can't get rid of the part because that's been developed to protect you, and it has, there are many different parts. So it's allowing the parts to voice and be heard, and then in some way unhinge from the protector part that was defending you and take on a new role. Is that clear as I'm describing it?
Yes. And I think there's that element that we can think there are parts of us. Again, perhaps I must always be mindful to speak for myself because it can translate for other people. But for me, certainly having experienced sexual abuse, familial sexual abuse when I was very, very young, which went on for a number of years.
I am so sorry.
That we can split. And the beautiful little girl who had to hold so much and survive and not tell, it can be very helpful because that part of us is associated with something so evil and so dark and shameful that it's easier to keep her locked away. When, of course, that little 5-year-old, 3-year-old is just spending her whole life wanting to be back in the fold.
Yes, to be heard.
And for me, that manifested in so many ways where it's almost like you've got a little person inside you going, see me, hear me. And until we see and hear ourselves and let her out into the light and embrace her and thank her for holding all the pain. And this is where I think Melanie Klein's theory about splitting, which is for me, if I explain it, that my little girl who was so violated, that the only way I could function in life was to keep her sort of, well, actually over here as I envisaged it, so away from me, which really in reality meant that I was walking through life not whole and doing everything I could to not see
shut
that
her
part.
up.
Yeah. And yet, oh my goodness, when in therapy I've been able to say, what have I been doing? You spent all your life in the dark.
Being silenced.
And I'm silencing you.
Yeah.
And to bring her in and to actually say thank you for her strength and the warrior, which is sort of more the team, but she's the warrior too, So to
And
understand...
acknowledge her suffering.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's what it does take work. My goodness, it takes work. But for anyone listening who has felt the shame, pain, a sense of something being wrong, a sense of dissociation, of not feeling quite all
Me,
there.
but not me.
Yeah. You know, with the right support, we can bring those parts of ourselves back into the fold. And I see it as a soul alignment.
Yes.
I really see it as a soul alignment. And that's where the peace is. And Margot Sunderland, who with whom I trained, she often talks about the sort of fear of going into therapy as we think we're going to go in and find a cave full of monsters. And actually, when we do go in, we find that the cave is actually full of sparkling jewels. And I love that.
That's beautiful.
And I think that is, what I would really say to anybody who is feeling in some way disconnected, is that with the right support, you can come back into being. And it can feel so scary because we experience that pain as a child because we're sort of stuck, or I was stuck back in that time warp in that room, and going back in and...
It's terrifying.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
But also, and I really appreciate your openness, and I could feel such tenderness both to that child in you and you as the adult who's kind of brought her into the fold of you and aligned your soul, and that she's she's powerful, that child now, but also still wounded in a way. I mean,
She is, yes, I mean,
but
think
she's a force.
She's a force, and I think the role now is, that's why I will advocate till my last breath for other children. And
I get that now.
Yeah.
Clear.
Yeah. But there's I think if she would...
She's here.
She's here. Yeah, she's sort of like, do you know what? Yes. There's a sense of her not wanting to be a victim, and I wonder there's a bit of defence in that.
You're punching. You've got,
you know, well, I did go back in and do quite a lot of punching and kicking. So this is the other thing with somatic work. I'm a big, huge advocate of sort of working somatically, where we can actually punch and kick and fight our way, and shame on you
and defend ourselves.
Yeah. So she's actually saying, do you know what? No, I've been there, and I'm okay. Is what she wants to say. I'm okay. Yeah.
I'm not in that dark anymore.
No.
I'm not a victim anymore.
No. And because she has me.
Taking care of her.
Yeah. Because she's finally
speaking for her. Yeah. Advocating for her.
Yeah. And that she trusts me as the adult to do the right thing. I often find this,
That's very moving. Very moving.
I often find when people are like, are they listening to this going, what on earth are they talking about? There are all these different parts, you know. I don't know whether, I hope because it's quite an odd concept, but I hope it makes sense, because my little one is saying, is everyone getting this? Because it's quite complex, but actually I'm trying to make it, I mean, gosh, it's been a journey. It's been decades, obviously, of becoming whole. But I do want people to know it's possible. It's not without... Yeah.
You're the living evidence that it's possible.
Yeah.
And I think people may not understand parts, but I think we all recognise the child in us. And we may dismiss the child in us, or we may be scornful of the child in us in some way. But I think what you have so kind of powerfully illustrated is that when we bury the suffering child in us, for whatever the reason the suffering is, the child actually operates the adult, because everything you're doing to block the child is actually blocking your present and your future. Yeah. So that when you dare to find the jewel and the precious and open the kind of door, as painful, as difficult, as terrifying as that is then when you can be free to be fully yourself and dare to love again.
Yes.
Dare to trust again. And dare to have two beautiful children, despite IVFs and miscarriages. Because I imagine if you hadn't done that work, there's no way you'd have had the robustness or the agency to kind of dare even have children, maybe, who knows.
That's right. And I think, I mean, there is some scientific research to show that those who have suffered sexual abuse when very young can find it. I'm not saying this obviously for everybody, but I think it was true in my case. I mean, there were physiological issues in my case, but then also I think that was related as well, you know.
Yes.
The sort of the somatic, you know, any issues I've had have all been in my womb, funnily enough.
Yes, it's not that funny.
No, not that funny.
And not that surprising.
No. And I think, I mean, also I was bulimic for many, many years. And that is also, as I understand it now, that there was all a way of, well, I mean, it's multifaceted, but the darkness of, so first of all, it's my little girl saying, hello, I want to be heard. And actually, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to make you eat. So there was that. And then
to fill the hole.
And then there was the bringing it up to kind of, to get rid of that horrible feeling.
Expel it.
And then there was the association of having been given sweets. So the sweets and the shock, and the sweets keep you silent and all of that stuff. So it's just this pernicious association. And so toxic. And, you know, I am free of that now. But I think, again, this is where the mechanics are really helpful alongside the therapy, because when one starts to understand oneself, it's like, I wasn't a bad person. Very often being bulimic, we can feel so out of control, and it's a very scary place. But when it starts to make sense of, if I listen to my little girl, then she's not going to drive me to keep eating. So we can start making our peace that way. And I really want people to, if they are in a place of feeling out of control, it starts with a conversation within, and that's what really releases us to be free of all those terrible coping mechanisms that can rear their head otherwise.
And I mean, I can see you stroking your heart and in a way soothing yourself too, because this is painful stuff.
I knew it was going to happen, Julia. Did you? Like, oh gosh, I'm seeing Julia. It's all going to come out.
I didn't know.
I phoned my husband just before I came in. He said, I'm trying to be very contained. I'm not sure if I want to go there. Anyway, here we are. It's important. It
does feel important.
Yeah.
And the most personal is the most universal, in that there'll be thousands of people listening who will recognise their own version of what you've said. And in you having the courage to be so open and describe the process of, like, facing the pain is how you begin to live fully in the present, and that everything you do to block the pain is the thing in the end that does you most harm. And that often a route in isn't what we think, it's what our bodies are telling us. So looking at behaviours, looking at, am I using food? Am I using exercise? Am I using alcohol? Am I using sex? Am I using work? What am I using to block me fully experiencing? And that might well be the route in to open oneself up, to be free, to be more fully yourself.
Yes. And also, if I might share, even just sitting here now, so I feel the fizz of my nervous system, and I talk to the children in the therapy room about this, I can feel the tingling in my fingers, and I can feel the tingling going into my toes. So that fight, flight, these are all that my nervous system is saying, my goodness, we're having a really important conversation. It feels a bit scary because other people are going to be listening to this. They're going to know. And I want, again, if we're going to just this way of saying, this is normal, this is my nervous system, and I can sit here and say, it's okay, it's all right.
And take a breath. I mean, if you were my client, I'd say, take a big breath in through your nose. And in that kind of moment, I could really feel both the tingling as aliveness, but also the calm that you have this capacity now to know what's going on and how to kind of regulate yourself.
And the joy of, I think, having done this work, to be able to then sit in the therapy room with children who have experienced either the same or similar, to be able to see the light for them go on of knowing that it's normal. When I ask them, and I obviously talk about this in the book a lot, for parents to be able to have the conversation, where do you feel it in your body when you're afraid? And the children might look at me as if to say, in here, and they point to their head, or they point to their chest, or they clench their fists, and I say, yeah, that's normal. I feel that too.
Yes.
And the
relief.
The relief, because children are carrying, they don't know these feelings are normal. Am I normal? Is it just me? I can't tell anybody about these weird feelings. I might just go and punch something to get rid of it instead. Once they know that, yeah, that's normal. So that's why I'm so passionate and so grateful for the journalism in it, being able to write this down and to share it in the way that I have, that I hope is going to be so helpful. Makes all my little parts happy.
So if your little parts are kind of sitting in a group happy about your book, what are they? What's the feelings that you have, and what do you hope? Because in some ways the book is the gift you give to the world from your own suffering.
Yes, and actually I'm going to say I don't think of them as parts, not correcting you in that, for me, because they're saying, well, actually I've got a teenager in there, and it's really helpful to think of ourselves as parts, but actually for me I find it really, I've connected with my inner children, and all of them, it's great because you sort of have this whole circle and they're all in here, and the teenagers are feisty. Yeah, it's the team. And I learned, now I feel very whole as I move forward in the world, but when I was sort of bringing everybody back in, everybody had a role, and I was identifying who was the real, there was a teenager who was she was going in.
The warrior's quite a mighty force.
There's the boundaries.
She climbed those mountains and swam miles and competed.
Yes.
But also gave you strength.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of gratitude. I wake up with gratitude, not for what happened clearly, but in a way, I was speaking to one of my sisters about having this conversation, checking in with her and knowing the damage that is done to children, and there is nothing that I feel now other than, I don't know, the words coming to mind: clarity, strength, wisdom, advocacy, passion, compassion too. And just wanting to do something with that, just wanting to do something, and I think that comes back to not because I'm out there trying to sort myself. It's, all of our work continues, but I've done enough to not to live in that beautiful place that's like that, in balance, and to know what I know what I don't know, to still keep learning, but to also be free enough of my past to be moving forward in a way that I hope is helpful.
And it feels like in doing so, you have found, the purpose and meaning of your life in the present and the future. Yeah. And that is a gift that many of us seek and not that many of us find.
Yes, I am hugely grateful for that. Somebody was telling me there's a book, and forgive me, I've forgotten the name, we'll have to look it up. But I think the author had written about the first act of our life is all to do with sort of affirmation and see me, hear me. And we all go into our careers on this basis of, the parent sort of, looking at the parent company organisation model of I'm trying to please the parent type thing. So that first act is to do with the affirmation. And then if we're lucky enough to have that epiphany, the second act becomes in service. And I thought, I need to read that because that's how I feel.
Yeah, that you're in service.
And to my children and my husband first and foremost, and to myself, actually. I mustn't, there's a great, we can forget ourselves in all of this. And that's my work, is to be reminded to remember to serve myself first and foremost, because there's always that act of giving, pleasing, that I think I've had for a very long time. And so now it feels good to take ownership and say my children, my husband come first, and myself in that. And then I can also help. So that's how I'm finding my balance rather than overworking and giving too much.
That is a beautiful place to stop, Kate. Thank you so much for such a meaningful and really moving conversation, and for being so open, but also the power of what you're doing and how you're, I guess, school by school, child by child, changing the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Emily and Sophie. We are going to be talking about the Kate Silverton conversation, which was very powerful and very kind of open and moving. And I wonder what your first responses are.
I think for me, the bit where she was talking about her own traumatic experiences is that really hit me. Like my heart hurt when she was talking about that. And it also sort of felt like this really beautiful kind of in vivo example of what you talk about, Mum, about post-traumatic growth, that you could sort of see the arc of, as she was talking, she was allowing herself to feel the pain that she felt as she was talking about it, and allowing that to sort of go through her, and also allowing herself to soothe herself. And there was something incredibly powerful and really moving about sort of really feeling that it like feeling her practice what she preaches, essentially, which is sort of that feeling the pain and also feeling the healing.
Such a beautiful reflection, because while I'm in it, I was really aware of viscerally the pain. Like I felt tearful, and then of course I did see her kind of go through it, but I hadn't thought of it in those terms. Because that's such a lovely way of understanding it, which I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and it kind of gave clarity to the passion with which she is communicating what she's communicating. That I was thinking there's a sort of authenticity there in her passion to share that healing is possible, that you can go to the darkest places and you can come back from them, where you get to be with all the parts of yourself and be okay. You know, it's not about getting rid of the things that have happened or deleting them, or that's not possible, but you can still get to a place of healing. And from, I guess, what I heard in her story that maybe other people might resonate with listening, is where something comes from in you matters. So often we're driven into all sorts of careers or choices or partners trying to resolve something else, and trying to resolve them through another means, but without being aware that that's actually what's behind those choices and decisions. And, she spoke about her own career in that way of kind of trying to reveal other people's suffering and inadvertently trying to help her own. And you could sort of feel the clarity of her purpose now, where they all aligned, where she understood herself, and this is an action not come to rescue herself, but from a kind of authentic desire to give back, and from a really clear place. And I really, it was very admirable and kind of moving to hear, but also it resonates, I think, often with my own experience as well, is when things come from different places in me, I can do the exact same thing or say the exact same thing, but where it comes from just changes everything about how it lands and how it's received or what comes from it.
Yeah, and for people who are kind of interested in that concept of that these are these unconscious drives that are pushing us to make decisions about what we do as a job, how hard we work, the relationships that we're in. I actually just listened to a really brilliant podcast, the Dr. Rangan Chatterjee podcast, where he interviews Gabor Mate, and they have a really powerful conversation about actually Gabor Mate's own experience and his own trauma and his own kind of unconscious drives that I think really speak to what you're saying. So if people are kind of interested in that, really, it's a really fascinating conversation.
I really enjoyed her talking about her book and about both of you going into the theory together around sort of the neurobiology of regulation and brain, the owl and the lizard, and I thought that was a really nice
baboon,
that's the third one, yeah. And I sort of also thought, the title I think of her book is No Such Thing as Naughty. And I sort of thought, yeah, but I think we could bring that into adulthood. It doesn't just have to be kids, right? We can't change what has happened, especially we didn't have choice as children, but even as adults, we can't undo what we've done or the choices we've made. And so our behaviors are not something to attack yourself for. But I think maybe one of the differences from when you're a child and when you're an adult is at this point, you are responsible for you. Nobody else is responsible for you by this point of adulthood in your life, other than people love you and they care for you. But ultimately, it's up to you. And so at this point is the point that you can engage with the way that she engaged and the way all of us have had to engage at times in our life about how our behaviors impact us. But it's not about criticism. It's where that piece where self-compassion comes in, isn't it? Where no such thing as naughty is because as an adult, as well as a child, is the self-criticism just shuts down the conversation, saying you're bad or I'm bad, I'm a failure, I do terrible things, or I'm weak or whatever, because I keep doing X or I'm still addicted to Y. It's also a checkout. It's not even saying I'm bad, that's it, that's the end of the story. Whereas if you can bring in the self-compassion and what the sort of research of what Christina Neff has shown is actually self-compassion is not excuse or indulgent or getting off the hook. It's actually the thing that makes people much more likely to take responsibility for their behavior because they can bear it. They can sort of tolerate looking at it in the eye. And then that's a place where you can be more in reality and go, do I really want to still be doing this? It might not be my choice that I ended up here, but it is my choice now about whether I keep doing it.
I love the idea of, and I think it's for all aspects of ourselves, of, in a way of parenting children compassionately, and there's no such thing as naughty, is how we can parent ourselves and also those around us. And Emma, I was wondering with you, what you must have a lot of thoughts.
I mean, yeah, and I think one of the main things around that is that I think that we have a tendency to think about a child and their behaviour. Yes, we think about the things around them, their school, their whatever, but I think I suppose my wish for like my field of child psychotherapy is to think much more about children in the context of their relationships. And a huge part of that is helping parents understand and regulate themselves, which is obviously what Kate was talking about a lot, so that they're able to do it for their children. But I think the thing of thinking about parents in isolation or children in isolation, it sort of muddies the waters in a way where I think really you need to think about children in the context of relationships and support them in the context of those relationships. And the earlier the better, because, I think we know our brain is born not connected up, and it gets 90% of connection is made in the first 5 years of life. So if you think about you as a parent sort of in that period, the more I think I would like us as a society to sort of be able to support that relationship, which, as you say, Soph, is nothing to do with blame or judgment or saying that people should
Shaming.
do better, but it's about thinking about what support can be given to that relationship, particularly in that first few years, that gives parents tools to be able to regulate themselves so that they kind of have capacity to stay calm when their baby is screaming and wonder about what's going on for their baby. So, I mean, I think, yes, I think I just feel very passionately about a lot of what Kate was talking about.
I thought of you a lot listening to it, actually. What's Emily going to say? What you were saying links to something else I kind of reminded me of, in context, how you are regulated in context, in relationship, was that I really like the podcast Therapy Uncensored, and Anne Kelly and Sue Marriott have a kind of what they call modern attachment regulation spectrum sort of theory, which is out in their new book that I bought but not read, but from their podcast, where they talk about attachment on a spectrum, which is probably drawn on other people have written. But traditionally attachment we think of as you're secure, that's your category, or you're insecure, anxious, and avoidant, or avoidant. Which category are you in? Whereas actually they talk about it in a way that makes sense to me. About being in the green zone, which would be sort of secure, red zone, which would be sort of your sympathetic nervous system. They're kind of lining it up with polyvagal theory, where you're sort of activated, which isn't always a bad thing, but can be when you're shouting and or shutting down or fight, flight, freeze, and then the blue zone of kind of hyper-regulation and sort of your whole system going down into the blue, as they call it. And that to think of, in a way, attachment of how much time do you spend in each of those zones? But we all visit all of the zones, and to think about, are there certain relationships that it's really hard to stay in the green zone with that person. I'm quite good at being in the green zone with this and that context, but in that context, I really go into blue or I go into red, and thinking of it as a movement like you were saying, in context. And for kids, that's the same. Like, what are the environments where they find it quite easy to be regulated and in the green and feeling secure, and what are the environments that set them off into those other less regulated spaces, and what helps bring them up and down. And I just thought that's quite a nice visual, and it's less of this categorical of that I am X. It's like, how long do you spend in the green zone?
I do think in every aspect of kind of modern therapy, we are much more fluid about everything. I think really until like 5 years ago, everything was a category. You were avoidant attachment, or you were disorganized attachment, or you had a personality disorder, and it was very fixed. And I much prefer this fluidity, whether it is your gender or your psychological kind of label, that we're very rarely everything all of the time, and we are very attuned and misattuned to our environments. And actually, what's more important than giving ourselves labels is recognizing which of the environments that we feel safe in and which are the environments that we go into a kind of threat response.
Yes, and I think that kind of also speaks to, I think, how we are more and more thinking about mental health as a spectrum too, like in the same way as that you would think about your physical health. Bits of my body work really well at different times, but I've got a dodgy knee, or other times I'm really, really unwell. And I think the more we can kind of think about mental health in similar terms as a spectrum that you move up and down on at different phases in your life, the more it's kind of normalized to think about your mental health at all. And I think we also know more and more how much your mental and physical health are interrelated. And so it sort of makes just much more sense to think about it in those terms, because actually sort of thinking back on it, it feels a bit sort of crazy to have
Being
them
split.
even sort of separated them, because they can't not be interconnected. But I also think, so when you're talking about the red zone, is it red zone?
Red.
I've already forgotten.
Yeah.
Blue zone.
We can put it in the show notes.
Red, green, blue.
Red, green, blue. And maybe me already forgetting undermines what I was about to say, which was, I think, what I really loved about what Kate message is also, how do we kind of translate these ideas, which I think people have an understanding from a kind of core level, like this makes sense, and yet then there's all this kind of neuroscience language about it that feels maybe not very accessible or not very relatable in a day-to-day way. And I think the more that you can kind of translate those concepts, like with the owl and the lizard and the baboon, I think it's incredibly helpful as a way of sort of bridging that gap.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And it's a great way, like you said, Sophie, of working with adults and children. That like a concept that I teach pretty much every child I see is the idea of your amygdala as essentially like the fire alarm panic button in your brain, and it's there for a really good reason, because you need to know if there's a fire, so you need to know if you need to get out of the building. But sometimes our wiring is a bit faulty. There's lots of different reasons, and if you've got a sort of fire alarm that's going off all the time, like what are the things, how do you know that it's a false alarm? How do you kind of figure that out? And then what are the things that you can do to try and sort of make it go off less often?
That's a lovely analogy.
And most children I see love learning about their brains.
Yeah.
You could draw it, couldn't you? I mean, it's a sort of natural thing to be able to draw.
It reminds me of when I used to be a research assistant at UCL, actually Eamon McCrory, who Kate mentions at the Anna Freud Centre, who also works at the Anna Freud Centre. Anyway, it was a brain scanning study on children who'd experienced maltreatment, and obviously was one of the things they were looking at, and noticing when in the sort of fMRI brain scanner, they were shown different emotional faces, but also one of the tasks, they were shown so briefly it never past conscious awareness. They weren't aware they were seeing sad faces,
like
angry faces,
subliminal.
subliminal. Yeah. They just thought they were looking at shapes or words, I can't, whatever it was, something neutral. And what they found was that children who had a history of maltreatment did have a much higher amygdala reaction, not only to threatening faces, i.e. an angry face, but also to neutral faces. Like their brain was over-identifying threat, but also this was happening even without the child's conscious awareness, right? So if you imagine a kid in the classroom who just sees an angry face, doesn't even really notice they've seen an angry face, and their whole body becomes upregulated and they kick off. What appearingly seems out of nowhere, right? But from their physiological point of view, their heart's going, their muscles are pumping, something's gone,
The
threat,
fire
threat,
alarm's
threat.
ringing.
The fire alarm is ringing, right? And they had a lovely thing at I think you both know about this anyway, but for the listeners, that I think it was with Arsenal Kids Football Club, was it? But certainly they used it at, I think, where the concept came from, but actually at the Anna Freud Centre school that was for kids who'd been excluded, they had those watches looking at their heart rate so that they had a sort of autonomic nervous system essentially tracker so that they could, and it would beep when they started going into sympathetic,
Heightened
When their
states.
heart rate went up.
Yeah, which was like a really lovely feedback loop. Like, oh, they could step out the classroom when that happened, but
Take
then
a
also they
breath.
could practice things and go, oh, look, it actually goes down. The numbers go down. I think it's lovely.
That's beautiful. So I really, really want to thank Kate for being so courageous and for finding her force now in what she's going to be doing, I think probably for the rest of her life. And I think we will all benefit from that and really appreciate the conversation I had with her. For those of you listening, do please share this conversation with people you think it's important for and rate and subscribe so that people find us. Thank you very much for listening.